Okay, so let's dive right into this. We're going to trace a pretty epic story, one that spans centuries. It's all about how a private company, yep, a company, trading tea and spices somehow laid the groundwork for a massive global empire. And what's really fascinating is how the ghost of that empire still shapes our world today, right down to who's on the money in countries thousands of miles apart.
It really all boils down to this one kind of wild question. How on earth did a private company selling tea and cotton in the 1600s lead to King Charles III being the head of state for places like Canada, Australia, and a whole bunch of other independent nations today? It sounds like a stretch, right? Well, in this explainer, we're going to connect those exact dots. So, our story doesn't begin with kings or generals in the way you might think. Nope, it begins with merchants. And this first chapter is completely dominated by what was arguably one of the most powerful corporations in all of history, the British East India Company. And this is where things get really interesting. See, the East India Company gets its charter way back in 1600. Its job? To trade stuff like spices, cotton, and tea. But it didn't just stay a company. It morphed into something else entirely, a kind of quasi-government, an imperial force that had its own private army and ended up ruling over millions of people. And this change, it happened incredibly fast. In 1600, it's just a business looking to make a profit. But by 1670, the King of England literally gives it the right to go out, acquire territory, and raise its own army. Just think about that. And then by 1757, it's using that army for straight-up conquest. The mission had officially changed from profit to power. The economic impact of this shift was just staggering. Before the company really took hold, India was an absolute economic powerhouse. It was responsible for a quarter, 25% of the entire world's GDP. By the time the British eventually left, that number had collapsed to just 2%, a complete and total reversal of fortune. So you have to ask, how did that happen?
Well, this quote from back in 1840 tells you pretty much everything you need to know. The company's policies systematically took apart India's own successful industries, especially in textiles. It basically rewired the entire economy. India went from a country that made and sold finished goods to the world to a country that just supplied raw materials, like cotton, for Britain's own factories during the Industrial Revolution. So the empire was built on a mix of commerce and conquest. But as it got bigger, its whole political structure had to change, especially for colonies like Canada and Australia. And this led to a completely new idea, a Commonwealth of Nations. Now, this wasn't some flip of a switch. It was a slow, step-by-step evolution. You start with a territory as a directly ruled colony. Then it moves up to become a dominion, which means it's mostly self-governing. That started with Canada in 1867. The real game changer, though, came in the 1920s and 30s, when these dominions were officially declared to be total equals with Britain, with their own full independence. And the key idea is right here, in this quote from the Balfour Declaration. This is basically the birth certificate of the modern Commonwealth. These nations were now equals, totally independent, but, and here's the twist, voluntarily united, because they all shared the same monarch. This elegant, kind of paradoxical idea, independent, yet united, is the absolute key to understanding how these countries are still connected today. But even as this new Commonwealth was taking shape, the very power that had built the whole empire was starting to fade. And for a lot of people, there's one single event in 1956 that symbolizes the moment it all came crashing down: the Suez Crisis. You've probably heard the story about Suez. Britain went into it as a global superpower and came out of it as a second-rate power. It's often painted as this one moment of sudden, dramatic failure that just slammed the door on the age of empire. But, history is almost never that simple. I think a much better question to ask is this: was Suez the disease itself, or was it just the big, obvious symptom? Did it actually cause Britain's fall from superpower status, or did it just pull back the curtain on a decline that was already happening? And yeah, the answer is pretty clear. Suez didn't sink the ship. It just showed everyone the massive leaks that were already there. Britain was already under huge economic strain, it was financially dependent on the United States, and its economy just wasn't growing as fast as its rivals. The British Treasury knew all of this. Suez was just the moment the rest of the world couldn't ignore it anymore. It was a massive, global reality check.
Okay, so that brings us all the way to the present day and to the really remarkable political arrangement that grew out of this long, complicated history of empire and evolution, the modern Commonwealth realms.
Today, that legacy lives on in 15 countries, 15 fully independent, sovereign nations that, because of this shared history, all voluntarily recognize King Charles III as their monarch. And you can see that direct line tracing all the way back to that path to self-rule we were just talking about. It started with those original dominions, Canada and Australia, and it kept going right through the 20th century as countries like Jamaica and Tuvalu gained their own independence and chose to keep the monarch as head of state. Now, here is a really, really important distinction to make. The 15 Commonwealth realms are different from the much larger Commonwealth of Nations. That bigger group has 56 members, and most of them, like India, are republics. The realms are that very specific smaller group that still shares the British monarch. You can think of it like an inner circle inside a much larger club, but they were all born from the same history. And this isn't just some dusty old historical artifact. This is a living, breathing, evolving system. Just in 2021, Barbados made the change from a realm to a republic. And other countries, especially in the Caribbean, are having serious discussions about whether they want to do the same thing. This story is absolutely still being written. Which leaves us with one final, fascinating question to think about. We've traced this incredible life cycle, from a trading company to a global empire, and from that empire to this unique family of nations. As more of those nations debate their future, are we now watching the final gentle closing of this very long and very complex chapter of world history?